Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Patrick Spiro, and I'm the librarian of the American Philosophical Society. I'd like to welcome you to our first virtual discussion of the fall semester. I'm really excited to hear the conversation between Audra Wolfe and our head of scholarly programs, Adriana Link. I also want to encourage everybody to check out all of our upcoming virtual programs. Our virtual discussion today is in lieu of our usual in-person monthly lunch at the library. Unfortunately, we can't meet in person like so many other institutions. We are operating primarily remotely, but I do want to encourage everybody to check out our virtual offerings online. Almost every week, we offer some sort of program to expand your intellectual horizons. And I want to draw special attention to our upcoming conference on September 21st to the 25th. Relationships, Reciprocity, and Responsibilities. This is a week-long project that explores the work that Indigenous scholars, community-based scholars, and archivists and librarians have been doing in a range of different fields to advance knowledge and understanding. So please check out our programming online at www.amphilsoc.org/events. And to introduce the rest of today's program, I'd like to turn things over to Kyle Roberts, the Associate Director for Library and Museum Programs. Kyle?
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kyle Roberts. I'm the Associate Director for Library and Museum Programming at the APS, and it's so wonderful to have you all with us today. Today's virtual discussion is a conversation with Audra Wolfe on her new book, Freedom's Laboratory, The Cold War Struggle for the Soul of Science. And I'm glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars around the globe. Even in the midst of an ongoing pandemic, we remain committed to serving our mission of promoting useful knowledge through virtual programming like today's conversation. As Pat noted, this is the first program of our new programming year, and there are several other events coming up this season. You can find all of our events on our website, which is amphilsoc.org. We have the conference next week, of course. On Wednesday, October 7th at 1 p.m., Raina Yancey will speak on the history of the Black lawyer in Philadelphia. And then on Thursday, October 15th at 1 p.m., we will launch our newest digital open data project, Investigating Indentured Servitude, a project that recovers 5,000 men and women who were indentured in Philadelphia on the eve of the American Revolution. It's a project that over 3 years of work went into it, and I hope you'll come back and learn more about how to use it. As you will see, you are on Zoom webinar mode today, so don't worry, you are all muted. Nothing is going to interrupt our program here. We're going to use the Q&A function. So if I could just ask you to take a second and look at the bottom navigation bar, probably right around down there, you'll see a Q&A. Any questions that you have for our speaker and our discussant, please enter them there. And you can ask your question at any point in time throughout the talk. We're going to leave about 15-20 minutes at the end of the hour session today so that we can get to your questions. We're really excited to hear your thoughts on today's topic. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's discussants. Dr. Audra J. Wolfe is a Philadelphia-based writer, editor, and historian. She's the author of Freedom's Laboratory, The Cold War Struggle for the Soul of Science, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2018, and now available in paperback. And I will be putting into the chat box throughout the talk some links so you can get to Audra's materials directly. She's also the author of Competing with the Soviets, Science, Technology, and the State in Cold War America, published in 2013. Her articles have appeared in both scholarly and more popular venues, including the Washington Post, theatlantic.com, Slate, and the podcast American History Tellers. Her editorial and publishing consulting company, The Outside Reader, supports the work of scholars and scholarly publishers. Leading today's discussion is Dr. Adriana Link, Head of Scholarly Programs at the American Philosophical Society Library and Museum. Adriana received her PhD in the history of science from the Johns Hopkins University, where she specialized in the history of 20th century sociocultural anthropology. She is currently finishing up her book manuscript, Salvaging Humankind, Urgent Anthropology and the Archival Imperative. And this really interesting and innovative work uses the Smithsonian's efforts to devise an international, interdisciplinary program in what she calls urgent anthropology to explore how post-colonialism changed scientific and museological understandings about the relationship between humans and the environment at the end of the 20th century. So without further ado, I'm now going to turn it over to Audra and Adriana for today's talk.
Thanks so much, Kyle and Patrick, and to all of you for being here today. I'm really excited for our conversation. We'll get Audra up on the screen. We'll get Kyle. There we go. Okay, perfect. Wonderful. Well, thanks, everyone. And particularly thank you to Audra for writing this really fantastic book. I had such a great time reading through it, and it's been such an important book for thinking about my own scholarship. So I wanted to start off our conversation today by thinking about one of the primary themes that you explore throughout the book, and that's the relationship between scientists and the United States government during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, really the height of the conflict that we now think of as the Cold War. But as you and I know, and as many on this call know, this is a pretty well-worn topic in the history of science. Conversations about the relationship between science and the state span across many geographies and time periods. So what makes Cold War America a particularly compelling case for exploring this relationship? And then as a corollary to that, why is the Cold War then so important for thinking about this dynamic in the present day?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that invitation to start thinking about this. And before I answer, I just want to thank you and the APS for having me on this call today. I know we had originally planned to do this in March, and sort of the first day that everything shut down. So I'm delighted that we are able to do this today. So yeah, I mean, these questions about the relationship between science and politics, these are kind of age-old questions, but I would have argued that when it comes to the Cold War, science and technology really have a special place during this time period for two separate reasons. One involves stuff, and that's really what I was writing about in my first book, Competing with the Soviets. In part because of several things that happened during World War II, but especially the atomic bomb, radar, the proximity fuse. The leaders of the Allied countries really assumed that their victory in World War II was related to science and technology. And so they assumed that anything that World War III would play out similarly. And so for that reason, almost in and of itself, science and technology took on this really special meaning during the Cold War period, really as stuff, as something that you could use, as something that was powerful, really in both displaying and maintaining state power. Now, the second way that science is special and important is more ideological, and that's really more what Freedom's Laboratory is about. And to understand this, we have to just kind of take a step back and recognize that the Cold War was in many ways an ideological conflict between, on the one hand, ideas about communism, and on the other hand, liberal democracy. And for the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, both of these countries understood their own ideologies in a way that really foregrounded the role of science and technology. So in the Soviet Union, the idea that science and technology would bring kind of prosperity and security and glory to all the people. And in the United States, the idea that democratic systems were really premised on certain kinds of rational thought, and simultaneously that you needed that you needed democracy to be able to further the kinds of scientific advances that would allow a democracy to continue to exist. So it was important both for stuff and for ideas in a way that I think is pretty unique and special and maybe unprecedented in recent history.
Great. So why then, why talk about the Cold War in the present day? I mean, what does sort of this book tell us about our current moment in thinking about the longevity or the legacies of that relationship, as you put it, both in terms of stuff and in ideology?
Yeah, I mean, I might have answered that question differently 2 years ago when the book came out than I would now. So I'm going to give you the 2018 answer first, and then I'll give you the 2020 answer. I think until fairly recently, most of the institutions in the United States, much of the scientific institutions in the United States, many of these institutions grew dramatically during the Cold War period. This is really when many of these institutions took their, were created, like the National Science Foundation, which came into being in 1950, or expanded dramatically, like the National Academies of Science, which just really changed the way that it operated during this time period. So any number of US scientific institutions kind of took their current form during this Cold War period. And I think for many scientists in the United States, the ways that they thought of themselves in science came out of that period in ways that had really been invisible to them. It was just sort of the way science was. It wasn't a historical artifact to them. It was just science operates in certain ways that involve scientific freedom, that involve funding for basic research, that involve scientists running programs and kind of the government being fairly hands-off in a lot of ways. And so when I was writing this book, mainly writing it between about 2015 and 2017, it had already become clear that this was no longer the case in the United States. And scientists were struggling to find a language to talk about what was happening. And what it seemed to me is that a lot of the language that scientists were relying on to try and defend science and scientific institutions was this Cold War language that was really no longer compelling, because it was language that was developed to contrast the United States with communism, systems of scientific freedom against communism. And without communism as this foil, the arguments that American scientists were making to defend the National Science Foundation, to defend other kinds of scientific integrity, didn't really make sense. Now, I said that I might answer that differently now. I do think that the conversation has changed pretty significantly in the past, really in the past 4 years. I think that the ways that science policy has changed has been, in some cases, has been operating in a vacuum, or in some ways has been actively shunned aside in favor of various kinds of either ideologies or conspiracy theories or political gains, has really forced scientists to think about what it means to say that science is apolitical, or what it means to say that science should be separate from government. Really, the excesses of the current administration have forced pretty much all scientists to engage with these questions and say, okay, we all have a politics. What does it mean to do a kind of science that is valid, that is useful to the public, while acknowledging that we have a politics? But so that's where the book came from. And I think it is still important that we do fall back on a lot of this language of scientific freedom. But I think even now, many scientists have a more sophisticated understanding of the political stakes of saying that science is apolitical than they did even 2 years ago.
Great. No, that's great. And actually, it leads me to the next question. So going back to the Cold War for a minute, I mean, I think you do a really fantastic job of centering just how important science was in these ongoing conversations about cultural diplomacy and navigating that really kind of fraught relationship during the Cold War. But what I find so interesting and so amusing throughout the book is really, you know, the U.S. agencies that you write about are so committed to, you know, making science apolitical. But this sort of ongoing American anti-communist sentiment keeps getting in the way of that project. So I was hoping that you could maybe talk a little bit more about that as sort of an underlying theme throughout the narrative, and also talk about how the scientific and intelligence communities navigated this sort of persistent feeling of distrust, and how that may have changed or not over the period that you write about.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in this book. And so let me just, for those of you who haven't read it, I'm assuming most of you probably haven't read it, let me just back up a little bit to explain why any of these ideas have anything to do with one another, right? Because on the one hand, we're talking about ideas about science and ideology. And then on the other hand, we're talking about intelligence agencies, and maybe we're talking about cultural diplomacy. So one of the things that's important to understand during the Cold War is that this was one of the first time, I think the first time, that the United States had really committed itself to a peacetime psychological warfare program. And so the United States had overt agencies like the US Information Agency. It had some kind of gray area agencies, and it also had kind of covert agencies, which included some arms of the CIA that were involved in promoting ideas about American life. So during this period, especially from about 1950 to about 1967, the CIA was actively funding a variety of cultural projects that were doing some things that were relatively innocuous as the CIA goes, right? So these things might be like textbook translation programs or sponsoring programs on science and freedom. So often the most nefarious thing about these programs is that they simply weren't what they said they were. They would often be programs in the name of freedom that were sponsored by someone other than whom they claimed to be sponsored by. So all of this is happening during the same time. Now, another thing that was happening was that the United States, for the first time, tried to establish a permanent intelligence agency, the CIA, which came into being in 1947. And so in the late 1940s, the United States was trying to figure out, how do you gather scientific intelligence because of this issue of science as stuff, these concerns about bombs, about radiation, about new technologies, the stuff that would be really important to know. And on the other hand, how do you use ideas about science to promote the American way of life, to appeal to allies or potential allies, or non-aligned countries, countries that they weren't being called non-aligned yet, but they would soon in the mid-1950s. And so science becomes a really interesting area where all of these things come together, because it turns out that in scientific intelligence, a lot of what you need is what we would now call open source intelligence. It might be, for instance, a list of the 5 most prominent research institutions in a country, or a list of the 10 most prominent Western leading scientists, or a sense of what a given country is really good at. And all of these kinds of things are actually best determined through having scientists interact with one another. So during this time period, the United States made a commitment to really encouraging international scientific cooperation, to making it easier for scientists from any number of countries to get together, right, and interact with one another. This was consistent with the ideas that the United States was promoting about how science operated in the West. The United States was claiming that science in the Soviet Union was intensely nationalist as opposed to internationalist, that scientists' lives were controlled, that they couldn't speak to anybody else, that it was focused on technological achievement rather than basic research. And so the United States said, hey, we can be the leaders in scientific cooperation, and it will also help us gather intelligence. So this is what the United States attempted to do, particularly in the early 1950s. The catch was that, of course, this was also the height of anti-communism in the United States. And Congress in particular and the FBI were extremely concerned about any contacts the government officials had with people who were communist, rumored to be communist, had affiliations with fellow traveler organizations, basically anybody who had ever been near in the room, gone to college with a communist. And if your job was to try and get information from scientists who had those characteristics, you would inevitably get in trouble with either Congress or the FBI. And that is exactly what happened with the State Department scientific attaché programs in the early 1950s. This was a program that was designed to both further US-led international cooperation in science and gather some scientific intelligence. And Congress basically shut down funding for it. And so for many years in the 1950s, the United States basically did not have a functioning kind of science branch within the State Department. And the group that was doing that within the CIA was really limping along because they were also under suspicion. And that didn't change particularly until after Sputnik in 1957, when Eisenhower in particular, and then later Kennedy especially, really embraced the idea of a prestige race for science. And it was really only at that point that other branches of the government were willing to say, okay, fine, we can let scientists talk to communists. We understand that this might actually help America's standing in the world. But it really took the shock of Sputnik to drive that change.
Great. For those who haven't read the book yet, I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what were the different methods or sort of opportunities for exchange. I know that you talk about a number of them in the book, but what did sort of science diplomacy, if you'll allow me to use that shorthand, what did that look like on the ground during this
Yeah, I mean, I think the key idea for science diplomacy during this time period, and in some ways even into the present, really has to do with this notion of arm's length relationships, right? Because there's a paradox at the heart of what the United States was trying to promote with its ideas about science. And that is that in the United States, the government doesn't control science or scientists, right? And so that's a very challenging message to communicate via official channels if your message is that the government is not in charge of it. So what the United States did over and over and over again was partner with either non-governmental organizations or other kind of private bodies to do its work. A classic example was the partnership that the State Department had with the National Academies of Science throughout most of the 1950s. The National Academies really became the government's de facto contractor for international science during that time period. Because of some of the issues affecting the State Department, as I've mentioned earlier. But even organizations like the National Science Foundation, their representatives could not go to international meetings if there were going to be representatives there from countries that the United States didn't recognize. Whereas that would not be a limitation for a private body like the National Academies. And so similarly, even NASA's original legislative charter allows it to do international programming and to run international fellowships. Even though that exists in the charter, NASA did not administer its own international fellowships. The National Academies did it for them, right? So there's this consistent way in which the United States was relying on these private partners. From a methodological perspective, as a historian, what it means is that you're often writing about, I wouldn't call them mid-tier. I mean, these are often kind of fairly well-known and well-respected scientists and scientific administrators, but it's not necessarily high-level policy. It means that you're writing a lot about people who come off as career bureaucrats, that those are the ones who are driving this policy. There's a whole cluster of people who I came to informally call, international men of science, who were often prominent in their field, but not super famous. Often they were biologists or chemists. Who had this role. Very few of them are household names. They are people like Bentley Glass, whose papers are at the American Philosophical Society, where I did a lot of this research. So it's often not quite stated in the kind of main like State Department papers or U.S. Information Agency papers or even NSF papers. It's often kind of the private groups that were doing this work. So for instance, I mentioned textbook translation earlier. The Biological Sciences Curriculum Study was doing a lot of work in partnership with a variety of different agencies. And that's a little hard to pick up in the archives of the federal agencies, but it becomes very, very, very clear when you're reading the institutional memos and correspondence of the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study.
Great. So you mentioned Bentley Glass, and early in the introduction to your book, you make a point of saying that your work in Bentley Glass and the papers here at the APS were really what got you interested in writing this book, and in particular, you were interested in sort of figuring out how he quote unquote got away with being both sort of an advocate for more progressive social reforms, as while navigating a very political. Conservative political and scientific climate. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how writing this book changed your understanding of both Cold War science as well as scientists who were working as part of these programs and initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I should say to that is just to make clear that I now understand that was so the wrong question to ask about Bentley Glass. That was all wrong. So, there's a whole literature on science in the Cold War that really came out of a reaction to Vietnam era politics on US campuses. And so really an entire generation of scholarship on science in the Cold War that sought to understand why so much classified and military research was happening on campuses and who made it go away. And then there's a related strand of that literature that was very focused specifically on McCarthyism and people who stood up to McCarthy, And one of the take-homes of that literature as it existed 10 to 15 years ago was really the idea that if you wanted to succeed as a scientist during this time period, you had to keep your head down or there would be consequences. People would, a classic example would be, say, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who of course was very deeply involved with the bomb and lost his security clearance in 1954, in part because of his opposition to developing the hydrogen bomb. And that story about Oppenheimer is true, and there were a lot of people who were hurt by these kind of anti-communist concerns. That said, that literature tended to focus on people who had power in the first place and lost it, or people who had, people who had access to a lot of various kinds of power and maybe didn't have quite as much as they thought they should have. And so Bentley Glass kind of falls into that category. And as I was, he's an interesting character because he broke all of the rules as I understood them 15 years ago, and that he, he held public office. He was the head of the Maryland ACLU for 10 years. He very famously refused to sign a loyalty oath. He, in his mild-mannered way, supported, in a very moderate, and I want to make clear in a very moderate way, supported civil rights, in the 1950s. And I wondered, and yet his career thrived. He criticized Fallout. He was one of the most outspoken voices on Fallout in some ways. And yet he had a very high clearance and was advising the Atomic Energy Commission. And so I wondered how he got away with all of this. And as I spent time in the archives, I started realizing that he had deep correspondence and very close relationships with a lot of people in other parts of government, including the intelligence agencies. His brother was an intelligence agency during World War II. Glass himself was sent by the State Department to occupied Germany in 1950. I believe he was kind of gathering information on the state of German science at the time. And he started kind of fielding correspondence from the CIA as the president or a leader of some of the organizations that he was a part of. And I wondered, what is going on here? What is going on here? And I eventually realized, of course, it's a mistake to think of the government as a single block. On the one hand, Bentley Glass has a 200-page FBI file that's fixated on a $5 donation that he gave to a student-led civil rights group in the 1940s. But at the same time, the CIA found him very useful and the State Department found him extremely useful, because it turns out that the people like him who could be critical of the government were exactly who you want to use on the international stage to say, in the United States, scientists can criticize the government. So yes, he was having trouble with the FBI, but he was also extremely useful for this scientific internationalism issue. And that pattern comes up over and over again. The people who were most deeply involved with US cultural diplomacy, for the most part, were not conservative. They were moderate or even what might have been considered liberal in 1950s America. They were not radical by any stretch of the imagination. And that was one thing that I really, that it took me much longer than it should have to realize as I was writing this book. The people who had the more radical critiques weren't in the halls of power in the first place. And so that's why they're often not in this existing historiography. And that's changed a lot in the past 10 years. I think there's just a flowering of scholarship that's focusing on more oppositional attitudes, different kinds of organizing, different kinds of activism. And it's just so refreshing. It is such a different way to do the history of science. And it has absolutely transformed the way that this time period looks.
So I really love, especially throughout this book, you mentioned that the people you're writing about are sort of mid-level, lesser known names with a few exceptions. But I really appreciated how much care went into kind of giving them a personality. I think you describe Willard Mackley as being a physician and an orchid hobbyist, and Eugene Rabinowitz as having a penchant for bow ties. And there are these little sort of characterizations peppered throughout. So I'm sort of wondering, was this deliberate on your part? Are these characterizations a way for you to kind of challenge the assumptions about the apolitical and detached nature of scientists that were being actively created in this moment? I mean, did you think about this, or was this sort of just a happy
I love the question. I love the question. I was definitely thinking about how I was characterizing them, but it's actually a much more mundane writerly issue. When you're writing a history of bureaucrats, you can end up with pages that feel like acronym soup. And so one of the challenges of this book was trying to figure out how to limit the cast of characters and how to try and make the few people that I wanted to focus on memorable. To help them stand out from, a book that at times can get very deeply involved in the AEC and the NSF and the USIA and this acronym and that acronym. But it is true that I think when you start to write that way, it does force you to think about these people as rounder personalities. I was reluctant to use to incorporate much of what I found in the FBI files into this book, because FBI files are, of course, a problematic source that come from, that's premised on surveillance. And so it's not, in my opinion, something that you should really be basing much of your material on. That said, they can tell you some really interesting little details about a person's life. You can often get a sense of what their house looks like, or what kind of car they drive, or what their neighbors think about them. Those kinds of details didn't necessarily make it into the pages of this book. But I think as somebody writing it, it helped me understand that Bentley Glass was more than just a scientific administrator who always turned in his receipts within a week of travel, but that he was also, somebody who taught Sunday school as a Baptist, at his local Baptist church, and would give talks at libraries for free, but would charge other kind of organizations a lot of money. You could really get a sense of this guy's personality from his piles and piles of paperwork that are in the APS.
No, it's really great, and there was already so much interesting material to engage with, but it really did help kind of ground who these people were for the reader. So thank you. You mentioned the FBI, so I think I'd like to ask you about how paranoia played into the writing of this book. So several times, and I also love that you're so upfront about it. You say at one point about how, quote, researching the history of covert operations can make a person see links that don't necessarily exist. So how did you go about researching and putting together this project, and how did you resist the temptation of getting caught up in the conspiracy theories in the archive?
Yeah, I started writing this book, I started researching it in 2010, but I didn't really start writing it until 2015, and I was finishing it in 2017. And I will say that 2017 was a hell of a time to be writing a book about psychological warfare and to be thinking about conspiracies and trying to understand if things were as they seemed, but it was a really challenging time to be doing that. So this is an archival-based book. So there's nothing that appears on the pages of this book that I couldn't point to some kind of evidence for. That said, there are many other hunches that aren't on the page. And one of the moments that I'm proudest of is there's a passage where I'm talking about the national academies and their relationship with the CIA that is somewhat oblique in the text itself. And I had filed a whole series of Freedom of Information Act requests that finally arrived in the mail last summer. So in the summer of 2019, and this had been a FOIA that had requested information on all contacts between the the science office at the State Department and the CIA and the national academies. And so I got this packet of, about this thick of documentation that basically established that through the mid-1950s, the national academies was supposed to be generating information for the CIA for its scientific intelligence program, and to do that via the State Department, and that it wasn't working. And the CIA was greatly disappointed about that. You won't find that stated explicitly in the book. It's kind of implied, but not explicitly said. And it's not explicitly on the page because I couldn't prove it, and now I can. But so in general, this is an archival project. And one of the things that I did was, I was encountering a lot of obscure names and I didn't know who they were. So I would work in the archive with a tab open in my browser to an obscure website called namebase.net that is run by some kind of intelligence buff, I guess, that includes it's like an index of proper nouns that appear in intelligence histories. And some of these are very credible intelligence histories published by university presses, and some of them are less credible intelligence histories. But if I encountered a name that seemed to show up in a lot of unlikely places, I would run it through the database. And if it showed up in the database, I would see what kinds of sources it turned up in. If 3 of those sources were published by Oxford University Press, I might start looking further. And so a real turning point was when I learned that the Asia Foundation, which still exists today as a NGO in California, from 1950 until 1967, the Asia Foundation was basically a CIA proprietary. I think of it as some kind of combination of USAID and the Rockefeller Foundation, but kind of paid for by the CIA. That's a good way to think about what the Asia Foundation was doing. And the Asia Foundation had a lot of contact with, was fairly involved with a lot of international scientific programs. And so the thing about writing about cover organizations is that often you don't necessarily need to discover a secret. You need to know that the thing that you're looking at is not what it says that it is. So the Asia Foundation's cover has actually that's been established many times from 1967, mid-1970s. You can read all about it at the CIA's own FOIA website. But it's not uncommon now for me to see in scholarship, scholars referring to it as an NGO during this time period, because that's what it claims to be. And it's a reasonable assumption unless you are operating from an attitude of suspicion, right? And so it's not particularly healthy to be writing through an attitude of suspicion. And at the same time, you kind of need to have an attitude of suspicion when you're writing about people in positions of power who have access to institutional and government resources during the Cold War. And so that was a challenge that I struggled with throughout the writing of this book, and I continue to struggle with now as a historian of science who is much more knowledgeable about people in power than I am about people on the receiving end of power. It's very challenging to figure out how to write about this in a way that is ethical and constructive.
As somebody who's navigating a similar set of politics at this exact moment, I totally understand. So I may be sending you messages after this talk to get your thoughts on this. I have a couple more questions before we turn it over to our audience. And I do encourage everyone, if you have a question for Audra, to please submit it using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. There's a couple already coming in. But I want to turn back now to our present moment. And thinking about this book in conversation with the past few months. So throughout the book, newsletters, journals, publications, the press, media, all of these play a really important role as examples of science, both actively engaging and also distancing itself from the political sphere. And in February of this year, right before you were supposed to give your talk at the APS, right before COVID happened, right before everything that we've been sort of dealing with for the past few months, you began distributing your own e-newsletter, Never Just Science, which has really been a great read. It comes out Tuesday mornings? Is that Tuesday, Wednesday?
It comes out on Tuesdays. I would not say it comes out on every Tuesday, but when it comes out on a Tuesday.
I mean, it's been really great and does such a nice job of placing some of the episodes that we've talked about today and others in conversation with current events. So what prompted you to start this newsletter? Yeah,
I mean, and the shortest answer is writer's block. I've been trying to figure out what I wanted to write next. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to do after this book, on the one hand, I concluded this book basically saying this language that we have to talk about science isn't helpful anymore, and we need new language. But it's been hard for me to figure out what that new language is. And so my instincts were, I think as historians, it's often easier to focus on the critique. And so I knew I had an idea for critique. I wanted my next book basically to be a screed against scientism. I have a very clear sense of what that was going to be. And yet I found myself incapable of writing it. I kind of knew what I wanted to say. I felt like this was a book that I could probably write in 3 months if I could sit down and do it, and I could not make myself sit down and do it. So even though I know that the most productive writers are often driven internally, I respond well to external deadlines and public commitments. So I thought if I promised to write a newsletter on a regular basis, that would help. And it did. I was not expecting a global pandemic. And it turns out that this summer has been a particularly fraught time to be writing a newsletter about science and politics. And so the newsletter hasn't been quite what I thought it was going to be. I had a whole, list of topics. I was going to explain scientism, and I was going to, talk about what's wrong with evolutionary psychology. I'll probably do that one soon enough. But, what I found myself was really just kind of searching to understand what has gone off the rails in science policy, and trying to find new tools for thinking beyond that. So it's been a place where, in some ways, in a really public way, I've been exploring my own frustrations with the limits of history as a discipline to answer forward-looking questions, and the limitations of science policy as a field that has traditionally looked to expertise to solve problems. For the record, we need expertise. We absolutely need expertise. But expertise is not sufficient in a democracy, and expertise is generally not representative of the concerns of the people. And expertise is usually pretty bad at fulfilling the needs of people who are most vulnerable. And so thinking about what it means to talk and write about science during this time period, the newsletter has really been an interesting place for me to explore that. I wouldn't quite say that it has gotten me to a point where I'm finding joy in writing, but it has at least made it possible for me to write again, which is in a better place than I was 8 months ago. So I'm glad you're enjoying it so far. And for anybody else who wants to see it, it's a Substack newsletter, so you can just Google Never Just Science, or maybe somebody can put it in the chat. And yeah.
Great. I actually do want to turn now to our audience questions, because I think we're getting some really good ones. So I want to ask a question from Angela Vergara. Apologies if I've mispronounced this. And she asks, to what extent did the US export this model of science and funding to the global South?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I mentioned this organization, the Asia Foundation, earlier. And the Asia Foundation, both the Asia Foundation in its role as a CIA proprietary, and USAID in its official role as a US development agency, were both extremely invested in convincing countries that they should use the US model. Sometimes this was more about just modernization theory, this idea that big technologies would drive development in economies in certain ways, and that if economies and technologies went in certain ways, that you would inevitably end up with liberal democracy instead of communism. This was, of course, Walt Rostow's famous idea in his work on modernization theory. But in other cases, it was much more literal. The Asia Foundation was getting very deeply involved in science advising in some of the countries that it had relationships with. They had offices on the entire periphery of the People's Republic of China. And in some cases, they were making recommendations for who should be installed as senior government science advisors, even down to recommending what percentage of GDP should be spent on basic research, or saying that you should have something that looks like the National Science Foundation, and it should do peer review in exactly the way that the United States was doing peer review. Really, the idea that the United States had developed a model that was successful and useful, and that it could go to these other countries. Now, I want to be clear, I'm talking about what the United States was telling these countries. I'm not talking about what these countries did. I am a US historian. There are obvious limitations to this model and this mode of doing history. But I don't want to claim expertise on what I don't know about. I can tell you that I have seen responses from some of the leaders in these countries talking to US officials. And so Western leading technocrats in these countries were often very sympathetic to these ideas, right? But I'm only seeing the responses of Western leaning technocrats. These are the people whose responses are going to ended up in the kinds of archives that I saw. So it is a limitation of this particular way of doing history. If I had the book to do over again, I might have done it in a very different way. But I felt that we were at an urgent moment to talk about what it means to talk about science and politics in this way. And so I think historians often end up working with what we have.
Great. There's a couple questions about what kinds of science in particular were involved in these projects. So I'll ask this question as it's written. To what extent did scientists' own conceptions of internationalism or cosmopolitanism influence the broader US policy of promoting exchange in the early 50s? And then was there disciplinary variation, for example, between biologists and physicists? Another way of asking this is, how did you strike a balance between intellectual and institutional history? And then another person asks about whether or not physics should be considered as the archetype of Cold War big science.
Yeah, this is a great constellation of questions. And let me start with the easy part first, which is that the reason you see so many biologists and chemists is because they are less suspicious, right? That if you're a nuclear physicist circulating on the international stage during this time, hanging out with State Department guys, you might be assumed to be a spy. And also, conversely, it was easier for these biologists and chemists to not get in trouble on the US side, not being seen as secrets. And sometimes that simply has to do with networks. There was a chemist named Roger Adams from the University of Illinois who seems to have single-handedly seeded a network of science attachés. The number of US science attachés who either went to the University of Illinois or studied with somebody who went to the University of Illinois is remarkable. So it's a combination of a discipline that doesn't look suspicious and institutional networks. Now, the broader question of kind of where does this come from? The thing that's really important to understand about US science policy circa 1945 to 1950 is how small it is, right? And so the people who are making these decisions about what it's going to look like are often science administrators who are themselves scientists. And so one of the things that's both challenging about this story and in some ways unsatisfying, I know some audiences would like a starker answer from me on this topic. This is not necessarily a case of the government using the scientist, and it's not a case of the scientist convincing the government to do what they wanted, right? These ideas are in circulation during this time period. And during this period from the late 1940s until the mid 1960s, when these ideas about cultural diplomacy and freedom were ascendant, both scientists and the US government stood to benefit if these ideas about international cooperation were in circulation. The scientists who were promoting these ideas, many of them genuinely believed that science will function better in circumstances of cooperation rather than competition, or certainly national competition. I think they genuinely believe that. At the same time, many of them also genuinely believed that liberal democracy would be better for science than communism, and that one of the hallmarks of that is a kind of scientific freedom. And if you can encourage structures that promote that, it is all to the good, right? So it's kind of the same people. I mean, when you look at people like Lloyd Berkner and Vannevar Bush, who are kind of putting some of these ideas into place, they're scientists too, scientists and engineers too. And they're all, you didn't have to twist a scientist's arm that hard to say, hey, can you come to this meeting to talk about scientific freedom, especially for the biologist. I don't want to spend all the rest of the time that we have on here talking about Lysenko, but I have, of course, omitted the other obvious reason why biologists were particularly interested in talking about scientific freedom. And that's because a lot of these ideas of how science operated in the West were made up to be basically the opposite of a caricature of Soviet science that had to do with Soviet genetics under the leadership of Trofim Lysenko. So that's another important piece of the puzzle that I probably should have mentioned earlier. But I talked about
how did we avoid Lysenko for so long?
I don't know, man. I think we almost here got through a discussion in which I talked about Freedom's Laboratory and didn't talk about Lysenko. But if you want to know about Lysenko, read chapter 1.
which is excellent and really does set the stage, particularly for the end of the book. There's a nice kind of symmetry, which you note was not what you intended, but perhaps we'll get back to that point if there's time. Related to the point you were making before, there is a question about the relationship between Cold War science and business. And we haven't actually talked about that in too much detail. We've mostly talked about the government and sort of scientific societies and institutions. So can you talk a little bit more about how this story maps onto this relationship between Cold War science and business? And I think actually that has pretty profound implications for the latter half of your story as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that there remains a great deal of work to be done on this topic. I can tell you that at one point, one of the chapters that I dropped from this book had a lot of dropped chapters. It originally had too many chapters. But one of the chapters that I dropped was actually going to be about some of the private programs that emerged in the late 1960s and early 1970s after the CIA's covers were blown. So when it looked like the United States could no longer do cultural diplomacy through its covert channels, and it was turning to private channels for real, the United States government was especially encouraging partnerships between private enterprise and international development involving science. I can tell you that that phenomenon was happening. I decided not to write that chapter early enough that I decided not to really read those materials. But I can tell you that it was happening. On the broader spectrum, these ideas about the relationship between free enterprise and science were part of the ideology, but to a surprisingly small extent, in part because the ideology that the United States was promoting during the 1950s and 1960s, when it came to kind of science in the system of the West, was much more about promoting the idea that you could have government sponsorship for science without government control. And for the record, it's not a particularly internally coherent narrative about how you do science, but it was basically kind of a government should give blank checks to scientists to do what they wanted. And so in part because there was so much emphasis on this language of basic research, that could very easily tip into this language of pure research. And so in the 1970s and 1980s, when we start to see more private investment in science, this is part of what scientists are reacting to when the Cold War occasionally gets invoked as kind of this golden era of government research, right? And of course, it was never a golden era. Somebody is always paying for it, and whoever is paying for it always has expectations. But so that's a very complicated answer to say. There's a series of different answers to that. There are some really great, excellent projects that could be written about the role of private enterprise driving international scientific development, starting in the mid-60s, about through the mid-1970s. And then there's a separate story that's somewhat surprising about how small a role these ideas about private enterprise actually played in the messages about science and freedom that the United States was promoting during that time.
That's great. It actually leads very nicely into the next pairing of questions. So Andrei Andreev asks about examples of pivoting to basic research in the US as opposed to practical science of the USSR. But I want to add to that question, David Gary's question about the stuff of science that you reference. And he asks, beyond nuclear weapons and radar, what are some other less obvious techniques that the West and the communist bloc competed over in the Cold War? So in particular, he's interested about whether or not there was competition over computer technology.
So I'm not going to answer the specific question about computer technology, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about one of the things that happened after Sputnik. So one of the things that happened after Sputnik was that all the government agencies were trying to figure out, what do we do? Because Sputnik wasn't necessarily a surprise, but the extent of the international panic over whether Sputnik meant, the panic among American allies, that Sputnik meant that America was losing its scientific edge, that was somewhat of a surprise to the United States. The United States hadn't quite anticipated that. So a bunch of planners, particularly in the US Information Agency, were trying to figure out, so what is the American ideology in science? What do we promote? And the United States quickly realized that it assumed that it could not win the space race. Obviously, that attitude later changed under the Kennedy administration, but at least between 1958 and 1960, the assumption was that the Soviet Union was just better at that than the United States was, and that it would be impossible for the United States, with its democratically controlled budgets, and I mean that in in terms of budgets that are subject to electoral controls and checks and balances, that it would be impossible for a government that functioned under democracy to invest that kind of money in technological achievement. So what the United States could win in was cooperation. The United States could be the best cooperator. The United States could show that it understood the needs of newly independent nations when it came to science better than the Soviet Union could. And so to a surprising extent, kind of referring back to this earlier question about what disciplines, to a surprising extent, they're almost pushing philosophy of science more than science. What they wanted to do was to say, hey, our way of thinking about the scientific method, this is what we're good at. And it's both a remarkably idealistic and remarkably cynical way of doing international competition. Because if what you're doing is saying that you are the best cooperator, and you are making grounds, you are making possibilities for other countries to work together and pull off collaborative achievement, then you can claim some part of their success in anything they do. So you can both genuinely further cooperation, and science is a collaborative, it is a collaborative exercise. But then you can also use those same successes to say, we were part of that, we're better at that. So yes, it's a complicated, really complicated and sometimes surprising story that can make it hard to think well of your actors in a way that is challenging from a writerly perspective.
Well, so on that note, I want to return to my last question, which is about your epilogue, which is just so profoundly powerful honestly, as a standalone part of this book. And in it, you reflect on the shifting significance of science for diplomatic relations, shifting from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. You talk about how attitudes towards science and scientific authority have been challenged from both sides of the political spectrum, from liberal sides that are arguing against kind of the power dynamics behind science to the evangelical right who are arguing that, why should we trust this? Why don't we take, all counts into consideration? And then, of course, what happens when science remains committed to its association with empiricism and political neutrality? So I guess to end today, if you could revise your epilogue now, given all the things that have happened since the book's publication, are there other points or takeaways that you might like to include or expand upon, given your feelings now?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm so glad that the epilogue resonated with you. That epilogue represents my thinking in the book, pivoting in real time, recognizing the ways that my own work had been complicit in furthering these ideas about science and knowledge and power. And so in the epilogue, I was reckoning with my own assumptions about how power worked and thinking about how I could do better. I think the biggest change I would make now, I continue to be surprised, perhaps I shouldn't be, but I continue to be surprised by the pull of conspiracy theories. And I think, as many white people have, I have underestimated the pull of ideas about white supremacy and white nationalism in driving people's actions and their willingness to bend reality to further those goals. I kind of alluded to this in some ways in the epilogue, but and it was beginning to dawn on me at the time that I wrote that epilogue. But I think the events of the past 4 years have just really highlighted, particularly when we look at COVID deaths, the ways that many people in positions of power in the United States are just willing to make things up if it serves their broader interests has been deeply discouraging. And it's something that I struggle with, to figure out how to talk about it in a way that isn't just nihilist and that figures out where we go from here, because this is the moment that we're at. This is the only world we have. We have to live in it. And what we have is broken, and we have to find new ways to be in it and of it.
Great. Thank you so much, Audra. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you today. So I'm so glad that we were able to do this. For folks whose questions we didn't get to, I will send them to Audra after we finish up the Zoom today, so she can take a look and get back to you with her answers. If you haven't already purchased your copy of Freedom's Laboratory, now available in paperback, I do encourage you to do so. And a reminder too that the APS hopes that you will join us next week for our conference on relationships, reciprocity, and responsibilities, Indigenous studies and archives and beyond. And there is a link to register for that event in the chat. So thank you, Audra. Thank you all, and be well, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.